Nekromantik, the 1987 film, is definitely its own little piece of something. The first time I saw this film, my opinion of it was, and probably rather very naive, which is still a way I want to view the film because I like the fact that someone dared to take something obscene, grotesque, and dare to make it seem beautiful and artistic. And to me, that is what the main appeal was, especially these love scenes between a living person and a corpse. It's very, in my opinion, it was very artfully and tastefully done, very well treated. You do have these blurring effects and this odd music, which definitely could have been a lot more, it could have been better selected. And it does get annoying after a while, I would say, but to a degree, I still want to say that I noticed and I saw beauty in it. And upon rewatching the film, yeah, I can definitely, because it's been years in between viewings, I want to say the first time I watched this was back in 2015. And so rewatching it recently, definitely a lot more of the obscene is apparent, but to a degree, I still want to believe that the filmmaker had something to say or something to present rather than just being, somebody who was just goofing around. Because as the director had stated in a previous interview, he pretty much created the film as, I guess you could say, somewhat of a protest against the German film rating system. But it definitely does feature the life of two very unique people. I assume he's some sort of an independent contractor. Forget the title, the main character's name, not that it's relevant, but he pretty much just cleans up after, I guess, human roadkill in one of the early scenes in which a couple is hit by a train. He's part of the cleanup crew. They go and they clean this up. He brings back an eyeball as a souvenir, and the entire home is just filled with various objects, whether it's femurs, phalanges, things incorporated into the furniture. He and his girlfriend definitely very much have somewhat of an Ed Gein thing going on, but they both seem to be death obsessed. But they enjoy the company of one another as well as their non-living company. One day, he makes the mistake of bringing a corpse home for them both to share, and of course, his lovely lady love just steps out on him with Mr. Dry and Scaly. And the remainder of the film is just basically his, what would you say, his human erosion, his decomposition of the spirit. You get to see him break down as a human and as an individual, and you realize, well, other than just this affinity for non-living things, he really did care about this woman, and he isn't coping well. Ultimately, he takes his life, but I think it's just witnessing in between, just kind of like his, I wouldn't want to say his descent, because he was pretty low to begin with, but there definitely is a breakdown there where he just pretty much just comes down to his base, and which really isn't much of a core to begin with. He's a very flat character. He isn't very well fleshed out. The film does not feature much dialogue, if at all. And to me, that's the interesting thing, because I feel that so much is just left for the audience to just fill in the blanks. You can tell yourself your own story. You don't have to be spoon-fed, well, this is going on for this reason. This is why this person has this interest. Who cares. That's not the point of the film. It's not that type of a movie. If you're looking for answers, watch something else, because this is not it. It's just a very simple, basic story. And as I said, you're left to draw your own conclusions, fill in the blanks, tell yourself the story for yourself, which to me is part of what makes it very interesting. It's a very unique film. It has a very different approach. Of course, Nekromantik 2, which was released in 1991, I don't consider it an actual sequel. I find the first film a lot more enjoyable in comparison to the sequel, or quote unquote sequel, but I think it's more a sequel in name. It's not an actual continuation of the story, but even though there were X amount of years gaps in between the two films, it's understood that this one picks up immediately where the previous one left off. We have a young woman who pretty much just robs the corpse of this grave robber, if you will. And she makes a lovely home for herself and he, and they you know, she definitely is an interesting character, just very different in her own right. And she obviously has a fair amount of female friends who share the same morbid or macabre interest of hers. So it's definitely, I want to say, if at all, if you really do need an answer of why did she go and dig up, you know, what's his face from the first film, I would have to say that she related to him. She noticed that they were similar, and why not feel more comfortable around a corpse of a person who had a similar interest in life that you currently have. So if you can't find a living person to share those interests with, why not the dead? But as luck would have it, she meets a fairly interesting young man herself who voices over pornographies. That is, he is a voice actor, if you will. I have no doubt to some degree in certain scenes of the film he voiced over his own sex scenes just for the sake of humor. The film, to a degree, I don't know if you would say it's a parody of the original or if it parodies itself, but there definitely is a lot more humor in the second one than in the original. Although I could see it very easily just someone else just stepping in and parodying both films. You can definitely play with it to a various degrees and angles, I would say, but it's just one of those very open-ended films, like I said, but very much in the vein of the first one. There are no answers. You're just observing these scenes. There are these extended date scenes between the two characters. Obviously, we see that they're bonding, they're growing together, they seem to like each other, but obviously we know what will happen. I'm not going to spoil that if you have not seen it, but it's pretty funny. I definitely had a chuckle the first time I saw it. Second time I saw it, I found it equally as funny. But I would say at its core, yes, it's definitely a film that centers around abnormalities and obsession, if you will, not necessarily a grotesque fascination, because to each their own, it takes all sorts to make a world, but what would you say? It's more a study of a very different human condition. It doesn't focus on the everyday man or everyday interest, and it's an interesting peek into someone else's life, a different way of living, a different way of seeing and viewing things, assuming you're willing to be open-minded enough to even just attempt at digesting the film for what it is. But I can definitely see that obviously having been released during the Video Nasties era, it definitely does fit the bill. It definitely is very outlandish and it's out there, but it definitely tries to do its own thing, and I can appreciate it for that. Is it a great film? Not really, no. Is it worth owning? That's up to you. You know, Arrow Video had released a very beautiful release of both films, very nicely packaged, but depending on your own cinematic interest or whether or not, because I wouldn't even consider this part of the extreme horror genre, definitely a video nasty, but I don't know, it's definitely one of its own different things. But to degree with both of these films, there is a love story element, whether it's, you know, my only complaint against the first one is the whole, you have the combination scene of the autopsy as well as the rabbit being skinned for dinner or something, but both scenes, the handlers, I would say, the person performing the autopsy as well as the person who was butchering the rabbit, it seems to show total disrespect for life, in my opinion, because it's very roughly handled. There is no care. There's no sign of respect for dead. And that's pretty much my only complaint, is something that seems to have such a focus or an obsession for the non-living, for death, but has no respect. It makes no sense to me, in the sense that if one has a fascination with death, one would assume that there is a respect for it, or perhaps that's just my own naive view there, but that's the only thing that just kind of throws me off there. But it makes sense considering the character's lifestyle, of how he chooses to live, how he chooses to end his life, which in itself is just very humorous as well. But as was pointed out to me, one could also say that, yes, Nekromantik is essentially a, what would you say, a necrophile's dream. It's somewhat of an excuse at a pornographic film. I really don't want to see it that way, but I can definitely see those elements. I can agree with it to a degree. But I really don't want to get into detail on that angle. I don't want to go in that direction. If you want to continue that discussion, then we can continue to do so in the comments. But it's definitely an interesting film. It's out there. It's not for everyone. But I like the unique presentation in which it was filmed, and the fact that it does have minimal dialogue. It allows the viewer to read between the lines and you tell yourself your own story. I think, to me at least, that's part of the enjoyment, is you don't have a story that's just handed to you. You create your own story.
Nekromantiks 1 and 2 are not movies that I would have on repeat, but I don't think the movies are made for rewatchability, to be honest. I admire the director's guts to take on such a disgusting subject matter. And if you're sensitive to any animal cruelty, I would say skip this one. Just fair warning for those with sensitive stomachs.
But as always, that is all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.